The Mothman. Was it this enormous monster, 6 foot tall, with a 10-foot wingspan and enormous red glowing eyes? Or was it a large American bird? Or maybe even a hoax? Let's talk about it in this episode of Inside Occult. On November the 12th, 1966, in Clendenin, West Virginia, 5 men were digging a grave in a local cemetery. Suddenly, a huge animal flew from the canopy of the trees and over their heads. Its body was human-like, it had enormous wings, and could dart between the trees, displaying extreme agility. The men were astonished by how fast this thing could travel. This is known to be the first sighting of the Mothman. Fast forward 3 days, and we get a much more detailed description of this creature. 2 young couples that lived in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, were out drag racing on an incredibly straight bit of road in Point Pleasant. This bit of road was famous for youngsters going out and racing each other. As they were driving, they noticed something in the distance on the road. They described it as having unusually large red glowing eyes. It stood 6 feet tall and had a 10-foot wingspan. The headlights of the car freaked it out and it instantly launched into the air like a helicopter on steroids. The young people themselves were also freaked out, as you can imagine, drove forwards as fast as they could. It wasn't long, however, before those glowing red eyes could be seen following the car from the air. They drove as fast as they could, reaching speeds of 100 miles per hour trying to get away. Might add that's extremely fast for the 1960s. However, this terrifying monster just kept up with ease. It started clawing the top of the car. They even had the scratch marks to prove it. It did, however, ease off and disappear eventually. They made an official report that the papers would headline, "Couples see man-sized bird, creature, something," and it spread like wildfire. The town was instantly fixated. Half the town went out in the following weeks to try and sight the Mothman for themselves, and many claimed to have actually seen him. This was in an area of Point Pleasant called TNT area. So TNT area was a secretive US government explosives factory during World War II. It was responsible for creating bombs essentially. And to keep the explosives from sight, just in case of an aerial attack, they divided it all up into separate bunkers that were dotted strategically across the landscape. Now, from aerial view, these bunkers looked like just a mound of dirt. They were covered in dirt and grass. When the war ended, the government shut down this facility and just took off, just left it abandoned, leaving more than 8,000 acres empty and leaving all the buildings abandoned. So the area today is actually a protected park, but it is still on the list for hazardous waste. It is believed that this is where the Mothman calls home, in one of those many enormous abandoned buildings. So once the papers released, coincidentally, the Mothman became a social butterfly. Apologies to the Mothman if he finds that term offensive. But basically, reports started coming in left, right and centre from everyone and their cats in Point Pleasant. Much to the joy of the cats of Point Pleasant actually, dogs started disappearing. Television started buzzing incredibly loud and those red glowing eyes were spotted everywhere. Everything was blamed on the Mothman. It also ended up getting quite a fair bit of coverage across America, and many so-called experts started giving their 2 cents on this cryptid. Some say it was a large American crane that had maybe deviated from its migration route. Now, the crane in question was not native to West Virginia, but it had most definitely been spotted there quite consistently throughout the years. This crane had big red patches around its eyes, however these would not have glowed. The crane, yes, can reach quite incredible sizes for a bird, however it's just not big enough to compare to what the sightings reported. The crane has a very slender body compared to the stocky being that was reported time and time again. It's also missing the human-like body, like arms and legs, or at least human legs. Crane legs look like matchsticks. The Mothman was consistently reported to have a big rounded head that sat upon its body. The experts started putting forward that it was actually an owl. You see, owls' pupils in the night, when shined upon, glow bright red. Like really bright red. Insanely bright red. However, these would have been tiny. Not the enormous, disproportionate, glowing red sacs that had been described earlier. Also, owls are even smaller than the supposed crane, so how could that even compare? People then started thinking about how contaminated the land and river was in that area, partly thanks to waste dumped from the old ordnance factory. So maybe it could be a deformed owl, a contaminated owl that has grown incredibly large. Its DNA had maybe deformed, letting it develop limbs that it should not have. You know, like in Chernobyl, the animals have been slightly deformed there, maybe not to this level. Or maybe it was just literally a giant owl. Incredibly rare instances, but it has been documented that many species have had freak giant specimens in the past, including humans. A whole plethora of further theories started flooding in, some insane as the Mothman himself. It was reported that the Men in Black were sighted around this time in West Virginia, a group of suspected government officials linked to UFOs and aliens. So naturally people started believing that the Mothman was maybe extraterrestrial. Although the unknown is frightening, the Mothman was actually embraced with mainly positive vibes. That was until, unfortunately, tragedy hit. On December the 15th, 1967, unfortunately, Point Pleasant's Big Silver Bridge suddenly collapsed, claiming the lives of 46 people. Unfortunately, a main component had fractured and the bridge essentially fell apart like matchsticks. Multiple citizens reported seeing the Mothman on the bridge the day before. Some people believed he was maybe trying to warn everyone of the bridge's collapse, that he could see the point where it was breaking, but most believed it was actually his doing. They believed that the Mothman had actually fractured the bridge section himself. Suddenly, Point Pleasant had no interest in the Mothman anymore, and when he was brought up in conversation, it was only with negative connotations. He became a taboo subject, and coincidentally, the sightings slowed dramatically. That was, however, until a novel and a film were based around the Mothman. This developed worldwide attention, and the world indeed did become obsessed. The small towns still held low enthusiasm. That was until the unveiling of their Mothman statue on Main Street garnered media from across the whole of America. Some pretty big media establishments came here to report on it. Suddenly, the residents realised that there might be some money to be made here. In 2004, the town launched the first ever Mothman Festival, featuring a whole Mothman museum. The residents claim that every shop on Main Street makes more profit on this weekend alone than the rest of the year combined. It's estimated that 12,000 people attend the festival every year. Additionally, a semi-recent game release featured the Mothman within, the controversial Fallout 76. This exposed the legend to a wider audience, and made it even creepier and more far-reaching than ever. So while most outright refuse to believe in this Mothman, a few are skeptical, and even fewer of these individuals actually believing him. It's still a great modern cryptid story. Bonus is it makes Point Pleasant a fucking fortune in tourism.